engagement or my adventure with stories began when I was little. Being an only child, I was left to my own devices, especially over the long summer breaks. And reading became part of my life from very early on. But much more than that, summer evenings, I'd gather the kids that I played with, about a ragtag band of 6 or 7. And I developed very early, like when I was 10 or something, the capacity to be able to tell the story from end to end. And they actually sat down and listened. They were by no means a captive audience, but they voluntarily sat down and listened. And so that's when I discovered, I think, now looking back in retrospect, the power that stories have to engage the listener, to captivate the listener. And that has stayed with me right through my life, through when I did Sunday school, and then when I went on to do my PhD, even because I chose to do narratives. I studied the Elijah narratives alongside the Moses narratives to see how they resonated with each other. And from then, ever since I've started teaching, I found myself encouraging my students to retrieve our storytelling traditions. And I think in any part of the world, really, storytelling traditions are strong, even in the West. I say that because the West seems to have gone into a long period of propositional communication. Point and PowerPoint really hasn't helped, has it? It makes things even more propositional than they need to be, bullet points and such like. So I've been encouraging my students to retrieve their culture, their traditions of storytelling, and use those traditions largely for the pulpit. And so we've been talking just now about, culture. So let me just pick up from where the previous PowerPoint left off. We've been talking about how stories are embedded into cultures. And since I'm a biblical studies, Old Testament person, if you like, we can take a quick look at Genesis 29. And if you can get it up on your phones or devices or in print. If you want, just take a quick look at Genesis 29, the bit where everybody knows the story, the bit where Jacob marries Leah and Rachel, how that happens. Take a look at that and you will see how deeply embedded the story is in its own culture. And if we fail to make the connects back into the world of the story, what we're calling cultural exegesis, if we fail to make the connects back into the world of the story, we are not able to retrieve from the text what perhaps the storyteller intended for us to receive. So do you want to take a quick look at it? Here is Jacob, who has arrived at the doorstep of his father-in-law, not yet father-in-law, his uncle Laban. And Laban is receiving him with open arms. In verse 14, Laban says to him, "You are my own flesh and blood," he says. And this is something that is not just common, but an obligation in Eastern communities. In India today, if a relative turned up on your doorstep, and a relative that you hadn't ever seen, but was perhaps a distant cousin, there would be the blood relationship obligating you to take them in, exactly like Laban takes in this man, this nephew he's never seen before, and Jacob stays with him. And at one point, Jacob says, Laban says, "What shall I pay you?" Usually nobody within a family setup, you wouldn't pay a family member. That's true of communities in the East as much as in the West, I suspect. You wouldn't have transactions. But Jacob has been looking after the sheep, and Laban feels compelled to pay this professional shepherd? And you see, Jacob already has his answer ready. He's been thinking about it. He's always your man with a plan, isn't he? So he's been expecting a question like this, and he has his answer all worked out. He says, I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. And here we have to immediately understand the cultural practice of bride price. What we have in India is the dowry, which goes in the other direction, where the family of the bride to be pays the family of the bridegroom to be a very substantial gift. But here it's in the other direction. And we remember just a couple of chapters earlier, one whole generation earlier, we remember how Abraham has sent camel loads of bride price through Eliezer to secure the hand of a bride for his son Isaac. And so now he is a man who has crossed the Jordan with nothing but the shirt on his back and a stick in his hand, and he has nothing to offer. And so he's carefully calculated it out. 7 years. 7 years is quite a bit. That is a comparable bride price. So that's cultural again, the whole idea of an obligatory bride price from the one who hopes to be the husband of the woman. And Laban says, now look at this, where's the cultural bit here? It's better that I give her to you, he says, than to some other man. Why would this be the case? You marry within families to keep property, anything material, to keep it within the family. You see, at a later time, Israel is going to prefer intra-clan or intra-tribe marriages to keep the land within the tribe, right? And we in South India have very specific practices for which side of the family, the father, the paternal or the maternal side, you can marry. And a generation previous to me, it was quite the custom so as to keep land, especially landowning families, to keep the property within the family. So Laban says, of course, I'd rather give her to you because then we would keep the money that comes in, namely the revenue through 7 years of service, we'd keep it all within the family. And so 7 years passes. And now he brings together all the people of the place and he gives a feast. And then he does his what is called a bed trick sometime in the evening. And we're thinking, I mean, anybody doing a quick read of this chapter would wonder how the trick happened even. How did Jacob not realized that he was marrying the wrong sister? How? And then you need all the background, the cultural elements that accompany a marriage. If you've been to any Islamic weddings, especially in the East, you will know that the men do their things separately and the women do their things separately through the day. And it's towards the end of the day that the bride is brought to the groom. She is brought heavily veiled, and there is even a little partition held between the bride and the groom through that last part of the ceremony. And by the time it's all done, it's almost evening. And so we have to remember that this is a place where there is not much lighting. It's evening. And she is brought to Jacob's tent. So it's really hard to say who the bride is till it's the next morning. So there you are, and a trick happens. And the next morning, read this bit. When you hear Jacob responding to Laban, you get an idea of how outraged the poor fellow is. Look at the series of rhetorical questions. What is this that you have done to me? He says. I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived? Here's a man who's extremely upset. In Eastern communities, whether ancient or present day, you don't speak like this to an older male family member, certainly not to someone who's just become your father-in-law and who till now has been your uncle. But this gives you an idea of how angry Jacob is. And why is this so? This is because, and here you go back to his own personal history. He's come out on top through uh, all his relationships so far, whether it's with his twin brother, or whether it's aging father, he has managed to be the one who deceives. And for him now to be deceived, to be receiving a taste of his own medicine, you can imagine how hard that is for his ego. But much more than this, remember, it's a matter of shame. This is a culture of shame and honor. And the whole village, usually the whole community, is invited. And that's what we have in India, what we call the big fat Indian wedding, just about everybody. And so you can imagine how shameful it is for him. I'm sure everybody is laughing. He's become the laughing stock in this community, which is really not his own. He's a stranger to it. He's the outsider to it. And all these insiders are ganged up together, laughing at him and appreciating the shrewdness of Laban, who managed to get his daughters married. And again, culturally, to get one's daughters married off is not a small thing. In India, we have a saying, even if you have to tell 100 lies, it's all right if the wedding gets done. So this is what has happened. Laban has managed to totally outwit Jacob. So you can see there is shame, there is a huge damage rendered to his ego. And then Laban, you can see that he brings up all the cultural reasons why he's done what he's done. He says, we gave the older daughter in marriage before the younger. In fact, we have something exactly the same. I don't know how it is in other parts of regions of the world, but if you had multiple daughters, you'd usually marry them off in their order of birth. And then Laban is also leaning on that other cultural practice, which is polygamy. It's all right for a man to marry more than one wife, and even if they were sisters. So he says, finish off the bridal week. Weddings, perhaps unlike in the West, in other parts of the world, can carry on for days. In India, it's easily a whole week, something like this. He says, finish the bridal week, and then we'll give you the younger one also. And then, of course, there's the clause in return for another 7 years of work. So you see how almost each verse in this story is so embedded in its own story world, in the time period and the culture in which it is set. When I was little and read the story, I used to think that Jacob married Leah, the unwanted Leah, and then worked a 7-year period before he married Rachel. That's not so. There was a bridal week for Leah, immediately followed by a bridal week for Rachel. So within a span of a fortnight, Laban's married off both his sisters, both his daughters, and the 7-year period of service for Rachel follows the double wedding. So now, when you get to the end of that section, and it says it was Rachel that Jacob loved, and the story that follows also, his regard for Leah, you feel really sorry for Leah, is because of all that has happened on this one night. How the trickster has been tricked. If we didn't appreciate the depth of all the cultural elements in the story, we might be able to understand why, for the rest of their lives, their married life, Leah is not anywhere in Jacob's priorities, despite the fact that she bears him a series of sons in great hope that she will get his affections, but she never does. Anybody wants to respond to that? Chuck, you or anyone else?
Wow, there is so much there. My goodness, when we stop and think about this one story. Now, granted, this is one of the uh, grounding pillar stories of the entire revelation of God. But how important is it that we take this same approach to every story that we try to help people live in? So, again, responses from everyone else now. Uh, uh, what are your thoughts on what's been presented so far?
Yeah, as the bottom line of it, I think if I had to sum it up in terms of what do we take away from the last 10 minutes of going through the story, I'd say that it's um, it's injustice done to the biblical text
Mm.
uh, to try to teach it or preach it without having educated ourselves, as in the 21st century, with a culture and language so far removed from that of the text, it does injustice to the text for us to try to teach it or to preach it without having done all the homework that we need to do to enter in a real and genuine way into the world of the story.
Mm.
Uh, so if I were to preach this, and I have on occasion, I would finish off like this by, it's part of a longer sermon on Jacob. I'd finish off like this. I'd say, if Jacob uh, had been given a sneak peek into the far future, he would have seen, uh, to begin with, that it is through the Leah tribes that two foundational institutions of Israel, the later kingdom of Israel, are birthed. That is, the institution of priesthood, which comes from the tribe of Levi, and the institution of the monarchy, kingship, that comes from the tribe of Judah. And if he could have foreseen that, if God had given him that sneak peek into the future, I think he would have valued Leah, or seen her in a quite different way. He saw her only as a loss, but it was that loss that God was able to turn to the gain of his people, Israel. And we in the 21st century, post Christ, we look even further and see how the Messiah, Jesus, comes from a Leah tribe, not from a Rachel tribe, not from Benjamin, not from the Joseph tribes of Ephraim or Manasseh. Not from any of those. In fact, those tribes dissolved into nothing in the history of, in the timeline of Israel. But it is from a Leah tribe that Jesus comes, that the great plan of God, which starts in Genesis 12, finally lands in the pages of the Gospels. And it is Jesus who, in himself, unites the two institutions, the two offices of the ultimate king and the ultimate priest. It's through a Leah tribe. Maybe Jacob sees it now in retrospect, as he's in a totally different plane and space, and maybe he appreciates Leah more. Take away from the story, if you want to be transformative to your audience, would be to show how what we perceive as losses, and for Jacob, this was a huge loss of face, of ego, of money, of 7 wasted years of work. It was a loss at many, many, many different levels. Him being almost immigrant labor, migrant labor in this household, nothing much more than that. It would have been a great loss, the marriage to Leah. But how God takes what we might consider a loss and turn it around for good at a level that might totally boggle our imagination. A transformative story, therefore.
Hmm. In many of the arts, we talk about layering, layering of a story, layering of music, layering of lots of different things. And what you've just shown us here is that, and I don't know if you have descriptives on what those layers are when we interpret a text, but certainly it reinforces that we've got to look for those layers that go all the way down to the redemptive layer. Have, have you considered that and done anything on that?
What I've done for us now with this sample text, yeah. Okay, let me break it down into three very basic elements. If I were to teach it or preach it, these are the three things I do with the text, really stripping it down to the basics. One is to follow the story through, just preach the story through without breaking it up into sections or points. Just preach the story through. The narrator has a single point that they want to make, and that point will simply land on your pulpit by you just telling the story. We don't need to look to see, oh, what are 4 points from here? And can I make the 4 points alliterate, peace and providence and porcupines? We don't have to do any of that. The story will make its own point. So just tell the story. That's one component, the story, and it's there. We don't have to add to it, embellish it in any way. It's a lily. We don't need to gild it. The second component of biblical storytelling, or storytelling a biblical narrative, would be what we've done just now is to make sure we enter the world of the text so we can it's like entering a movie or a really good book. To be there within the world of the story. You're a guest at that wedding feast and you know all the customs, you know all the practices. So when Laban says what he says, you perfectly understand. And when Jacob is asking 3 rhetorical questions in a row, you know how angry he is because that's not how he's supposed to speak to an elder. So do all the homework it takes for us to be part of the world of the story. That's the second component. The third, let's say, what was the first one? The biblical story, the narrative text itself. The second is the bridges back into the world of the story, so we can travel by that bridge and get there. And that bridge is a lot of homework. The third component is a bridge into the world of the listener, the one to whom you're telling the story, which can be your church congregation or your Bible study group or anything you please. The bridges into the world of the story. You see, as I was telling the story, I said, well, this is how it is in India. Those are my bridges into the world of the listener. So those are the bridges by which my listener travels into the world of this text. So that's the 3 basic components: the story itself, the bridge back into the world of the story, and the bridge forward into the world of the listener. These 3 components come together to make storying a biblical narrative. When we speak of layers, rather than layers, I'd rather look at it as how the story gets extrapolated backwards and forwards. As we were looking over the text, we did a little bit of extrapolation backwards into Jacob's deceptions, what kind of a chap he was, his characterization so far, and that helps us to understand how he feels when he's being deceived in this chapter. And then we did a little bit of extrapolation forward into the history of Israel, the institution of the monarchy and the priesthood. And then we extrapolated further into the New Testament and the coming of Christ. Yeah, so if you want, that's a 4th component. The 4th component being to be able to set the biblical story into the meta story, the meta narrative of the biblical canon itself. Is that all right? So that's 4 components then in faithfully telling a story from a biblical narrative. Does that help?